Tom Buschatzke is one of the most influential people in Arizona and the West when it comes to managing our water. He's worked on water issues for 40 years. As director of the Arizona Department of Water Resources, he has a hand in virtually every aspect of state water policy. Director Tom Buschatzke, welcome back to Square Off.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
We'll find out soon. The headlines are alarming. I'm hopeful you can give our viewers a really clear-eyed look at the short-term water future here in Arizona. And I want to start by asking you to give us kind of a hydrology lesson. Lots of folks watching might be newcomers to the valley, to Arizona. So explain the roles of Lake Mead and Lake Powell in supplying our water and generating electricity.
And so Lake Mead and Lake Powell are on the Colorado River, and the Colorado River supplies 40% or so of Arizona's water supply. Those reservoirs are designed to capture the water in years when the flow of the river is really high, and then parse that water out over the subsequent years. So we have a steady water supply. Unfortunately, lately the flow of the river has been declining, and it's because of the drier, hotter future, and maybe the drier, hotter today. That's due to climate change.
So I see respected water managers, policymakers, people you know and work with, using words like dire and bleak to describe the state of Lake Mead and Lake Powell. How bleak is the water outlook?
So in the next couple of years, we're not really in danger of having to shut off the taps of the home. But the levels of the lakes are such that it will become difficult to move water past the dams the way the infrastructure is designed. So even if there's water in the dam, it might be limited in terms of how much can come out. Obviously then the reservoir levels in Lake Mead, which receives water from Lake Powell, are going to drop if that occurs.
And how soon could that happen?
So if we do not take any action, that could happen as soon as 2023, with maybe the impacts really being felt in a couple of years past that, 2024 or 2025.
Next year. So folks hearing you saying that's not going to affect your taps, but this very bad thing could happen in just a year, might have trouble processing that answer. Explain that.
It's because the providers who provide water to your tap have multiple water supplies, and they also have groundwater that they can pump from wells. And we have water stored under the ground for that purpose. So there are methods to help backfill those reductions. But if they occur over a very long period of time or become very, very large, then we could have some problems.
So there is some urgency. The U.S. Department of the Interior is asking Arizona and other states to respond this week to a possible immediate cutback in their Colorado River water supply, that according to the Arizona Daily Star. Is that real? Can you confirm that?
So the letter from the Secretary really is asking the states to consider a proposal by the Secretary that would include moving water from reservoirs above Lake Powell into Lake Powell, and also moving less water from Lake Powell into Lake Mead, again, to protect the infrastructure and the ability to move water from Lake Powell to Lake Mead. And the letter uses the words health and safety, and it will come down to that. This is really getting to a health and safety issue.
When they say health and safety, whose health and whose safety are they talking about?
The health and safety of those who want to turn on the tap and have wet water.
Meaning it might not be there?
It might not be there, again, not tomorrow, not in the next couple of years, but out into the future. These systems and those reservoirs are very large, and things move relatively slowly. As long as you can move that water through those dams, through that infrastructure, which is now becoming at risk.
And what about the power generation part of this? Because they generate a lot of hydropower for the West.
So there's going to definitely be a reduction in hydropower at both Lake Powell and Lake Mead. But that's not why the Secretary's letter is coming out. There are other ways to get power off the grid that are out there, so we can do that with the power, but there's not other ways to get water supplies into the Colorado River.
The Secretary is also warning, or I think it's an Assistant Secretary, is also warning about a potential threat to the city of Page and to areas of the Navajo Nation if something goes wrong on Lake Powell.
So again, that's an infrastructure issue, and if you cannot move water through the power generators at Lake Powell, you might not be able to get water to Page, and then Page provides water to the Lachee chapter of the Navajo Nation as well.
So these are pretty dire and bleak descriptions of what could happen. Was this even anticipated happening so soon after the drought contingency plan was signed just 3 years ago?
So we had hoped the drought contingency plan would avoid this outcome, but we knew from looking at past hydrologic history that this was possible, and that this was possible in the time frame in which it is occurring. And we monitor this on a daily basis and are always thinking about ways to offset these potential risks and problems.
Will Arizona agree to the Interior Department's request to cut back by September?
We are still evaluating that, so I can't say yet what our response will be.
But you need to respond by this week.
But we will take actions to protect Arizona, to protect the ability to move water from Powell to Mead. I just can't say if it will be the specific action that the Secretary proposed, but we will act.
What is the impact of the mega drought and more recently man-made climate change, human-caused climate change on what's happening? For example, the river counts on the runoff from the Colorado snowpack. There's a pretty decent snowpack, but the runoff just isn't there as it's been in the past. What is that telling you?
Right, so last year there was almost 90% snowpack and only 32% runoff. That is because the soil is drier, the water seeps into the soil instead of the river. The snow turns into a gas instead of water because of wind and other atmospheric conditions. And more of the trees and vegetation are growing earlier in the year, so when the snow starts melting, the trees are growing and it takes up some of the water. So it is a trend we have seen over the last 10 years or so that the runoff is not equating to the snowpack, and it is a huge concern moving forward in terms of what our future is going to be with the river.
So talk about that future. Does the future look like it did just 3 years ago? You've talked about, I think before the committee in Congress, about changes in lifestyle, pretty serious changes in the way we do things. What do you see in the next 3 to 5 years?
So in 2026, we need to have a new framework to operate the dams, the reservoirs, the river, et cetera. We will struggle with looking at how much we anticipate the river will provide long term and what that means for all the allocations in all of the 7 states in Mexico that rely on the river. And there isn't enough water to meet all of the allocations, and we're going to have to cut back. And those cuts will largely be permanent. There might be some wet years when we get our full allocation, but we're going to have to learn to live with less water.
What does that life look like?
So that life is difficult to predict because, again, different water providers have different water portfolios. So you might see more calls for conservation. You might see harder calls for more xeriscape, low water use landscape, things like that. It's hard to say because we haven't really decided with the other states and the federal government what we're going to plan for post-2026 and what the water supplies are going to look like for each one of the states and Mexico.
And again, for folks who are new here, xeriscape means what?
More desert-adapted plants that use very little water.
And less grass.
And grass is not xeriscape. It uses
grass,
a lot of water.
A lot of water, and maybe
Correct.
grass's time is up. The legislature and the governor have $5 billion in surplus cash at their disposal. What's your advice to them on how to use it when it comes to water?
I am supportive of the governor's statement in his State of the State speech where he wanted to make a $1 billion investment into the water future of Arizona. There is potentially legislation to create a new Arizona Water Authority that would look at augmenting our water supplies and also helping to build infrastructure to deploy current water supplies, to use recycled water, and to take advantage of every drop of water we have, including doing some conservation programs and perhaps conservation programs with agriculture who still use over 70% of our water.
You've been in this business 40 years. Did you ever think this day would come?
I never thought this day would come this quickly, but I think we always knew that this day was potentially out there. And there's a lot of factors that go into it, but I think we can deal with it if we hunker down, if we get the water authority passed, and we start to look at both the short-term solutions and the long-term solutions. And there's no longer a one-size-fits-all. It will be cobbling together many small actions.
Many small actions. You know, in researching this interview, I thought of a quote from a Hemingway novel, Sun Also Rises. Maybe you read it. The question was, how did you go bankrupt? And the character answered, gradually, then suddenly. And I thought that perfectly describes our situation. You're smiling as I'm saying that.
Yeah, and we have been using the bank accounts that are created in Lake Powell and Lake Mead for the last 20 years. And it is gradual, and it becomes sudden if the reservoirs are empty. And our task is to avoid the outcome in which the reservoirs are empty.
And it's getting pretty close to sudden.
And it's getting near, and it's getting more difficult.
Tom Buschatzke, thank you so much for your work. Best
Thank you.
wishes.
Thank you.
And thanks for joining us.